She stood in the center of the ballroom and felt entirely invisible. The chandeliers above Hartwell Manor blazed with 1,000 candles, their light spilling over silk gowns and glittering jewels, over laughter and music, and the soft hum of approval that always followed the Duke of Hartwell. And there he was, at the very heart of it all, tall and impossibly handsome in his dark evening coat, his hand resting lightly on the waist of Lady Marguerite Ashby, his late wife's cousin. Evie watched as he leaned down to murmur something near Lady Marguerite's ear. The woman's laugh floated across the polished floor, light and knowing, and a fresh ripple of whispers moved through the crowd. Everyone saw, everyone understood. The new Duchess, married less than 6 months, stood alone near the marble pillars while her husband danced with another woman. Not just any woman. A woman who shared the same silver blonde hair, the same delicate features, the same musical voice as the beloved wife he had buried 3 years ago. Evelina Townsend, no, the Duchess of Hartwell now, kept her spine straight and her expression quiet. She had learned, in the brutal months since her wedding, that dignity was the only shield she could afford. She held her champagne glass with steady fingers and allowed nothing to crack. Inside, something small and hopeful was bleeding. A pair of older matrons drifted past, their fans fluttering like vicious little wings. "Still dancing with Marguerite," one murmured. "It's as if poor Catherine never left." And that girl standing there, what a sad replacement. They say her family was desperate. A trade, really. Money for a title. He hardly looks at her. Evie heard every syllable. She had been raised to hear everything and reveal nothing. So she smiled faintly, as though she had not just been peeled open in a room full of strangers, and excused herself toward the terrace. The cold night air bit her bare shoulders. She did not shiver. She simply stood at the stone balustrade and stared out at the dark gardens, the hedges clipped into severe shapes, the fountain silent for the winter. Hartwell Manor was magnificent and cold, and it had never once felt like home. Behind her the music swelled. She had been 17 when the arrangement was made. Her father's shipping business had crumbled overnight, leaving the family teetering on the edge of ruin, and the Duke of Hartwell had needed a bride with a substantial dowry to restore his own depleted estates. It was a transaction. She had known that. What she had not known, what no one had warned her, was that the Duke was still drowning in grief, and that her very presence in his house would feel like an intrusion. On their wedding night, he had escorted her to her chambers, bowed stiffly, and left without touching her. "You must understand," he had said at the door, his voice hollow, "this marriage is a duty, for both of us. I will give you my name and my protection, but my heart belongs to someone who is no longer here." She had nodded, her throat too tight to speak. For weeks she had tried. She had arranged flowers the way she heard his late wife had arranged them, pale roses and lavender. She had learned his favorite dishes and quietly instructed the cook. She had dressed in the soft colors she knew he preferred, had learned the names of his tenants, had read the books from his library so she might have something intelligent to say at dinner. He had barely noticed. At meals, he answered her questions with 1 or 2 words, his gaze always drifting to the empty chair at the far end of the table, the chair Catherine once occupied. Once, Evie had worn a blue gown that brought out the color of her eyes, and she had caught him staring at her with something sharp and wounded, as though her presence pained him. He had excused himself before the second course and did not return. She stopped wearing blue. The first true crack in her hope came on a rainy afternoon in late autumn. She had found an old miniature portrait in a drawer of the writing desk, a tiny painting of a woman with laughing eyes and pale hair. Catherine. She had been beautiful, yes, but there was something else in her face, something restless and hungry that the artist had captured without meaning to. Evie studied it for a long time before carefully placing it back. That evening the Duke discovered her near the desk. His expression turned thunderous. "You were in Catherine's things." It was not a question. It was an accusation, low and cold and final. "I only found a portrait," she said, keeping her voice even. "It fell from the drawer when I was looking for sealing wax. I meant no harm." He crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled the drawer open himself, checking the contents as though she might have stolen something. The insult landed deep in her chest and settled there. "Do not enter this room again," he said without looking at her. "This was her private study. It will remain as she left it." Evie had not cried. Not then. She had simply walked out, climbed the stairs to her own small sitting room, and sat very still in the chair by the window while the rain streaked the glass. She had married a man who could not see her, because every time he looked in her direction, he was looking for a ghost. The morning after the ball, Evie rose early. She dressed simply, a warm wool gown in deep green, and pinned her chestnut hair back with steady hands. Something had shifted inside her during those cold hours on the terrace, something quiet and resolute. She could not force a heart open. She could not compete with a memory, but she could decide from this day forward who she wanted to be. She went downstairs and found the housekeeper, Mrs. Pretty, already at work in the morning room. "I would like a full account of the estate's charitable obligations," Evie said. "The tenants, the village families, the widows and orphans under the Duke's care, everything." The housekeeper blinked. "Your Grace, his lordship's steward usually manages." "I am the Duchess," Evie said gently, but with a steel core the older woman had not heard before. "And I will manage it now." Within a fortnight, the small sitting room that had once been a storage space for unused furniture became Evie's personal office. She filled it with ledgers and maps, wrote letters to the parish vicar, and began visiting the tenant cottages herself. She brought baskets of food and medicine, sat with elderly farmers and listened to their worries, and arranged for a new roof on the widow Hatch's cottage before the winter storms arrived. The work filled the hollow ache inside her. It gave her purpose. It gave her a reason to wake in the morning that had nothing to do with a man who would not look at her. The Duke noticed nothing. He was away in London for 3 weeks, and during that time Evie transformed the small parlor into a warm, functional space. Painted a soft cream and filled with potted herbs that scented the air with rosemary and mint. She hired a young village woman to assist her with correspondence. She began keeping a journal of the families she visited, their needs, their stories. When the Duke returned, he strode through the front doors with his customary reserve, handed his gloves to the butler and asked, "Has anything occurred in my absence?" The butler, a loyal man named Phelps, hesitated. "Her Grace has been most industrious, my lord." The Duke's brow furrowed slightly. "Industrious." "She has taken over the tenant welfare, and the village donations, and the pension list, and she has converted the old blue sitting room into a study." A pause, then "I see." He did not seek her out. He did not ask to see what she had done. He simply retreated to his own study, the one that still held Catherine's portrait above the mantel, and closed the door. Evie learned of his return from a maid. She pressed her lips together, nodded, and continued writing a letter to the physician in the next town, requesting his attendance on a child with a persistent cough. She would not chase him, not anymore. The first real test came during a dinner party several weeks later. The Duke had invited a small group of neighbors, mostly political allies and their wives, and Evie acted as hostess with a grace that surprised even herself. She guided conversation, smoothed awkward silences, and made certain the shy wife of a baronet felt welcome. Halfway through the meal, Lady Marguerite Ashby arrived uninvited. She swept in wearing a gown of pale lilac, her silver-blonde hair arranged exactly the way Catherine had worn hers. The Duke rose immediately and ordered a place set beside him. Evie did not react. She merely smiled at the footman who served the soup and continued her conversation with the baronet's wife. Lady Marguerite, however, was not content to remain quiet. "I do hope you do not mind my intrusion, Your Grace," she said, her eyes sliding to Evie with something that looked like a smirk. Alexander has always told me I am welcome here anytime. Hartwell feels so much like home to me. She used his Christian name, deliberately, publicly. The table went very still. Evie lifted her wine glass and took a slow sip. "You are always welcome, Lady Marguerite. Any cousin of the late Duchess is a friend to this house." The words were perfectly correct, perfectly polite, and they placed Lady Marguerite firmly in the category of distant relation, not intimate confidant. A flicker of irritation crossed Marguerite's face before she recovered. "How gracious! I am sure dear Catherine would be so comforted to know her home is in such capable hands." The Duke, to his credit, seemed to sense the undercurrent. He looked at Evie, then really looked at her, as though noticing for the first time the calm composure in her expression. There was no jealousy there, no hurt, just a quiet, dignified patience. It unsettled him. She saw it in the slight narrowing of his eyes. That night, after the guests had gone, he found her in her study, still dressed, reviewing a list of supplies for the village school. "You handled Marguerite well," he said from the doorway. Evie looked up, surprised. It was the first personal comment he had made to her in weeks. "She is grieving her cousin. I understand grief." Something flickered in his face. "Do you?" She set down her pen. "I understand loss, Your Grace. Perhaps not the same loss you carry, but I know what it is to have a future you imagine taken from you." He was silent for a long moment. Then he gave a short, almost imperceptible nod and left. Evie stared at the empty doorway for a long time before returning to her work. Winter deepened. Snow fell heavy over the Hartwell lands, and Evie's work among the tenants grew more urgent. She organized firewood deliveries, distributed blankets, and personally visited a family whose cottage had partially collapsed under the weight of ice. Her hands grew chapped from cold, her boots perpetually muddy, but she had never felt more alive. The servants began to speak of her with a warmth they had never shown before. Mrs. Pretty, who had served the family for 30 years and had adored Catherine, took Evie aside one afternoon. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace, but you are doing a great deal of good," the housekeeper said gruffly, "and it has not gone unnoticed." Evie smiled tiredly. "Thank you, Mrs. Pretty." "His lordship," the woman added carefully, "he has not been the same since the late Duchess passed, but that does not excuse his behavior. You have been a true lady." Evie felt the sting of tears behind her eyes and blinked them away. She had not realized how much she needed someone to say that. Sir Julian Cross arrived in the village just before Christmas. He was a baronet, young and kind, with an easy smile and a habit of listening as though every word mattered. He had inherited a small estate bordering Hartwell and had come to introduce himself to his neighbors. He met Evie at the village Christmas market, where she was helping to distribute gifts to the children. She was laughing at something a small boy had said, her cheeks pink from the cold, a smudge of flour on her sleeve from the gingerbread stall. Sir Julian stopped in his tracks. "I beg your pardon," he said, approaching with a bow, "but I have not yet had the honor. I am Julian Cross, your new neighbor to the east." Evie straightened, her smile still lingering. "Welcome, Sir Julian. I am Evelina, Duchess of Hartwell." His eyebrows rose slightly. "The Duchess. I had heard rumors of your work in the village, but I assumed they were exaggerated. I see now they were not." His admiration was open and genuine, and Evie found it unexpectedly disarming. They walked together through the market, talking easily about the village, the tenants, the challenges of the winter. He did not treat her as an accessory to the Duke. He treated her as a person of her own. They met again the following week at a community dinner, and then by chance at the church while Evie was reviewing repairs to the roof. Each time, Sir Julian was courteous, interested, and undeniably warm. He never overstepped. He never implied anything improper, but his eyes followed her with a light that was impossible to misinterpret. The Duke, who had accompanied Evie to the church at the vicar's request, noticed. He stood a few paces behind, watching the easy conversation between his wife and the handsome young baronet. Evie was smiling. She was laughing, actually laughing, at something Julian had said about a runaway goat. Her whole face was bright with it. Alexander Hartwell felt something twist in his chest, something foreign and sharp. Jealousy. He did not recognize it at first. He had not felt possessive of anyone since Catherine, and even then the feeling had been different. More like guarding a treasure than fearing its loss. This was rawer, more immediate. His wife, his quiet, overlooked wife, was captivating another man without even trying. And she had not smiled at him like that, not once, not ever. He cleared his throat and stepped forward, his voice cooler than intended. "Evie, the vicar is waiting." She turned, her smile fading only slightly. "Of course, Sir Julian, will you join us? The roof repairs are a shared interest for the parish." Julian's gaze flicked to the Duke, reading the tension there with a man's instinct. He inclined his head politely. "Another time, perhaps, Your Grace." He bowed to Evie and withdrew. The carriage ride home was silent. The Duke stared out the window, his jaw tight, and Evie folded her hands in her lap and said nothing. It was the first time she had seen him unsettled. A small, traitorous part of her was glad. The weeks that followed were strange. The Duke began appearing in places he had never frequented before: the morning room where she took breakfast, the garden path where she walked in the afternoons, the corridor outside her study. He never stayed long. He never explained himself. But he was there, watching, hovering at the edges of her life like a man trying to read a book in a language he had never bothered to learn. One evening he found her in her study, bent over a ledger by candlelight, her hair slipping from its pins. "You work too late," he said. She did not look up. "There is much to do." He stepped into the room, and for the first time he really looked at the space she had created. The neat shelves, the maps pinned to the wall, the list of names and needs written in her careful hand. It was a room full of purpose, full of life. "You have done all this," he said slowly, "and I did not even notice." Evie set down her pen. "You were not meant to notice, Your Grace. I did not do it for your approval." The words were not sharp, but they struck him with the force of a blow. She had stopped seeking him, stopped hopping, and in her absence he had finally begun to feel the cold. "Evie," he started, and then stopped, as though the words were too large for his throat. She looked at him then, her eyes calm and clear. "Yes. I have been unfair to you." She said nothing. She did not rush to reassure him. She simply waited. "I have been distant," he continued, the confession dragging itself out of him like a wound reopening. "I know I have. I thought if I kept you at arm's length I would not betray Catherine's memory, but I have betrayed you instead, and you did not deserve it." Evie folded her hands together. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady. "Grief is a difficult master. I did not come to this marriage expecting to replace her, but I did hope in time that we might find some companionship, some mutual regard. When it became clear that was not possible, I chose to find purpose elsewhere." "You stopped trying," he said, and the words were almost an accusation. "Yes," she admitted softly. "I stopped trying, because trying was breaking my heart, and I could not live like that anymore." The silence that followed was heavy and full. He stood there, a powerful man, a duke, a man who had commanded armies of influence and respect, and he looked utterly lost. "Can you ever forgive me?" he asked. Evie considered the question. "I do not know," she said honestly. "Forgiveness takes time, but I am willing to see who we might become if you are." He nodded slowly. "I would like that." It was not a declaration of love. It was not a passionate embrace. But it was a door cracked open, and for the first time in months, Evie allowed herself a small breath of hope. The fragile peace shattered a week later. Evie was in the village when a servant rode hard to fetch her, his face pale with urgency. "Your Grace, you must come at once. There has been an accident in the East Wood." His Grace was inspecting the timber work when a tree fell. He is alive, but the physician says it is serious. The world tilted. Evie did not remember mounting her horse or riding back to the manor. She only remembered the cold terror that seized her chest and would not let go. She burst through the doors to find the great hall in chaos. Servants rushed with bandages and hot water. The physician's voice echoed from upstairs. And there, being half carried into the main parlor, was Alexander, his face ashen, his leg bent at a sickening angle, blood soaking through his sleeve. "Evie," his voice was a rasp, "you came." "Of course I came," she choked, already at his side, her hands shaking as she helped ease him onto the settee. "Do not speak. Save your strength." The physician worked for hours. The leg was broken in 2 places, and there was a deep gash along his ribs that had bled dangerously. By midnight, the worst was over, but Alexander was weak, drifting in and out of feverish sleep. Evie did not leave his side. She sat in the chair beside his bed, holding his hand, watching the candlelight flicker across his pale face. In his delirium, he spoke. "Catherine," he murmured, and Evie's heart clenched. But then he turned his head restlessly. "No, not Catherine. Evie, where is Evie? She must not leave. Please, she must not leave me." Tears slipped down Evie's cheeks. She pressed his fingers to her lips and whispered, "I am here. I am not going anywhere." He quieted then, his grip on her hand tightening as though she were an anchor in a storm. The fever broke at dawn. He woke to find her still there, her eyes red-rimmed, her gown wrinkled, her hair a tangled mess. "You stayed," he said hoarsely. "You asked me to." He closed his eyes briefly. "I remember. I thought I was dreaming. I thought you were Catherine for a moment, but then I knew it was you. I wanted it to be you." Evie's breath caught. She did not know what to say. "I have been a fool," he continued, his voice cracking. "A blind, stubborn fool. I held onto a ghost so tightly that I nearly lost the living woman beside me. I saw you, Evie. I saw you at the market, at the church, in your study. I saw your kindness, your strength, the way everyone who knows you begins to love you, and I was terrified." "Terrified of what?" she whispered. "Of loving again, of losing again, of admitting that Catherine and I were not the perfect story everyone believed." He drew a ragged breath. "There are things I have never told anyone." Evie waited, her heart pounding. "Catherine was beautiful and charming," he said slowly, "but she was also restless and unhappy. She found country life stifling. She resented me for not spending more time in London. In the weeks before her death, we were barely speaking. The night she died, we had quarreled bitterly. She wanted to travel to the continent without me. She said our marriage was a cage. I said things I cannot take back. And then, in her anger, she insisted on riding out alone in a storm. Her horse slipped on the wet road. By the time they found her, she was already gone." He was weeping now, silent tears sliding into his hair. "I have blamed myself every day. I thought if I kept her memory perfect, if I mourned her deeply enough, I could atone. But I was only burying myself. And I buried you too." Evie's own tears were falling freely. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead gently to his. "You are not to blame for the storm, Alexander. You are not to blame for her choices. You have carried guilt that was never yours to hold." "Can you forgive me?" he asked again, his voice breaking on the words. "I already have," she said, "but you must forgive yourself." It took weeks for his body to heal and longer still for his heart. But something fundamental had shifted between them. The walls had crumbled. The ghost of Catherine, so carefully preserved, had finally been laid to rest. They talked, truly talked, for the first time in their marriage. He asked about her family, about her dreams before the arrangement, about the work she had done in the village. He listened, really listened, and she saw him begin to see her not as a replacement or a duty, but as a woman he had nearly let slip through his fingers. Spring arrived, and with it a quiet, tentative joy. On the first warm day of April, Alexander insisted on walking with her through the gardens, leaning heavily on a cane, his legs still stiff but mending. The daffodils were pushing up through the dark earth, and the air smelled of damp soil and green things growing. He stopped near the fountain, the one that had been silent all winter, and turned to face her. "I have something to say," he began, and then hesitated, looking almost nervous. "I have no right to say it. I have done nothing to earn it, but I need you to know." Evie's heart fluttered. She knew somehow what was coming. "I love you," he said. "Not because you filled an emptiness, but because you are the most remarkable person I have ever known. I loved you too late, but I love you now, completely and without reservation." The fountain behind them suddenly gurgled to life, water spilling over stone in a silver cascade. One of the gardeners must have repaired it without their knowing. Evie laughed, a sound of pure, surprised joy, and Alexander smiled, really smiled, for the first time since she had met him. "I love you too," she said, stepping into his arms, "and I am so very glad you finally caught up." He held her close, his cane forgotten, his heart so full it ached. The garden around them bloomed, and the house that had once been a mausoleum of grief began, at last, to feel like home. The village saw the change. The servants saw it. Lady Marguerite, when she came to call some weeks later, saw it too. The way Alexander looked at Evie with quiet adoration, the way Evie's hand rested naturally in his. Marguerite's expression flickered through surprise, resentment, and finally resignation. She did not stay long. Sir Julian Cross attended their summer garden party and raised a glass to the Duke and Duchess with genuine warmth. He had found his own path, and he harbored no bitterness. But he did lean close to Evie at one point and murmur, "He is a lucky man. I hope he knows it." "He does," Evie said, glancing across the lawn to where Alexander stood, already looking back at her. "We both know it now." Years later, the people of Hartwell would still tell stories of the Duchess who had brought the estate back to life, not with grand gestures, but with quiet, steady love. They would speak of the Duke who had once been cold and distant, and who later could scarcely bear to be apart from his wife. They would point to the fountain in the garden, always flowing now, and say it had begun again on the day the Duke finally opened his heart. And in the manor in the study that had once belonged to a ghost, there sat a new portrait. It showed a woman with chestnut hair and kind eyes, a small smile on her lips, and beside it, written in the Duke's own hand, a single line. "She waited for me to see her, and when I finally did, I found my whole world." Evie would read those words sometimes, when the house was quiet and the fire burned low. She would feel her husband's arm slip around her waist, feel his lips brush her temple, and she would lean back into his warmth. The pain had been real, the hope had been fragile, the distance had nearly broken them, but the love that grew in its place was steady and deep and true. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.